We're going to shift our focus and begin our discussion of populations and succession. And during these chapters 3 and 4, I want to focus in on really dealing just with natural systems and try to leave us out of the picture for now, because our human demographics and our population dynamics are a little bit different than how ecosystems function naturally. So I might talk a little bit about us, but I'm going to leave that conversation for our future chapter 6, which is really dedicated to human populations specifically, because we don't follow all the same rules. First, I want to discuss population dynamics and do that by first defining some terms. When we talk about a population, we're talking about an interbreeding group within a single species. Okay, a population is an interbreeding group within a single species. And I define it that way because clearly the whole purpose is to reproduce populations, to reproduce the species. And when we think about a single species, we know that on a very rare occasion, species can interbreed with each other, but that is very rare, all right, based on our DNA and our reproductive methods. So we define a population as an interbreeding group within a single species. And again, that species can exist in different places, but we're talking about a very specific population in a specific place that's breeding with each other, okay? And the species might exist somewhere else, but they're not part of that individual population because they aren't part of that breeding group. When we talk about population size, we want to differentiate that from population density. Population size is the number of individual organisms present at a given time. Okay, the size is the number of individual organisms present at a given time. For example, in your classroom you may have 10 people present at a given time. We might say the population of students in school today is 500. We might talk about how many bunnies live in a certain community, and we could say 50 bunny rabbits. So that's the number of individual organisms present at a specific given time. Population density, again, when we talk about density, we have to take into account an area. So not only are we talking about the number of individuals in a population, but we're talking about the number of individuals in a population per unit area. So we might say, 100 people per square mile, 50 bunnies per square mile. There are 10,000 people in a 300-mile radius of my house. Okay, so we're talking about, again, being specific in terms of the location or the amount of space that that population is in. Now we're going to talk a little bit about population growth, and we're going to discuss two different types of population growth. The first type is logistic growth, and that really is demonstrated by populations that are growing and then they stabilize over time. So you'll see when we look at our graph here that we see time along the x-axis at the bottom, and then we'll see the numbers of the population going up the y-axis on the left. So increasing numbers over increasing time. We're kind of looking at that curve. So if we look at our actual curve on our graph, we see that, over time those numbers are, steeply increasing, and then eventually will level out at a certain number, okay, or fluctuate around a certain population number. And that's demonstrated by that letter K that's there, that stands for what we call the carrying capacity. And we'll get to that a little bit later. So some populations of species are represented by what we call a logistic growth curve. And that population growth, they increase and then they level out around this, what we call carrying capacity. And that doesn't mean there's always going to be 50 rabbits there or 50 bunnies. Okay, but it means that it's going to be, around 50 bunnies. So we might see 60, we might see 40, but it's going to fluctuate up and down over time. And that's really going to be controlled by what we call, our limiting factors, how, in our carrying capacity, how many organisms can that ecosystem support. We also call this curve an S-curve because it looks a lot like an S. So you'll see that on there as well, S-curve, or what we call logistic growth.
Here's just another representation of the same thing. You see your population size along the y-axis and your time along the x. And we see that kind of beginning exponential growth, but then you see that leveling off of the population around that carrying capacity. You see that maroon colored line there. And basically what happens is the population will continue to grow until it hits some kind of limiting factor. Here are some of the limiting factors they listed are the amount of resources that are available, temperature changes, temperature extremes, predators, predator-prey relationships. We can see them fluctuate together. We'll talk about that later. Parasites can control population, disease can control population. So there's a lot of different things, resources could be anything from food or water, etc. So any of those things and combinations of those things keep populations in check. They keep them from growing exponentially out of control under normal circumstances.
Okay, some populations their growth is not represented by an S-curve or logistic growth. They show more of what we call exponential growth, where over time, you see time on our X and, again, population number on our Y. Over time, we'll see our population just increase exponentially. And some populations do function this way. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to grow exponentially forever. Typically, there's going to be something that's going to limit their growth, and they're not going to continue to grow and grow and grow. They're going to hit some kind of ceiling. They're going to run out of water or food or shelter or space. They're going to run out. They're going to run into some competition for resources. Something's going to happen that's going to cause them to hit a ceiling, and they can, either level out or they're going to just crash down. When we think about our logistic growth that we saw on the previous screen, we think about some of our species that are, very stable in their ecosystems. And again, they just fluctuate around that curve, around that line of that carrying capacity. But when we look at these J curves, more shaped like a J than an S, we see this exponential growth. And that can be naturally happening for a species, like an insect species, that would grow really rapidly in the spring or summer, and then crash dramatically when, for example, temperature gets too cold. All right, so again, different population growth, and again, typically most of our species, our populations of species, will be represented by one of these two curves.
So again, here's a specific example where we see a certain population of birds, the Eurasian collared dove, in North America. Over time, you can see the years along the x-axis. There was no collared doves in certain areas, and then starting in approximately the year 2000, we see an increase in birds in that exponential growth, way up, representing pretty much exponential growth, or what we call a J curve. And that can be, like for this example, colonizing an unoccupied environment. For example, being able to use a resource that nobody else is using, and just being able to, exploit that where another organism isn't using it. It could be a food source, etc. And we see this often with invasive species that are not native to a certain area, but begin to move into an area where they have never been, and they can outcompete other species, other organisms for resources, they can outcompete them, and they can really, their numbers can climb dramatically. And we've seen that around the world with different things like the cane toads in Australia and the rabbits there, and the zebra mussels, which we'll talk about, that your textbook talks about, and of course the Asian carp. Issues that face our Great Lakes, for example, where they really have either an unlimited food source, unlimited resources, no natural predator, no competitor for resources, and they're able to just grow their population numbers high up. In addition, we as humans are showing exponential growth here on our planet, and we will spend a lot more time talking about that in our human population discussion in a couple of weeks.
So let's talk a little bit about biotic potential and some reproductive strategies of our populations. When we think about biotic potential is the number of offspring a species may produce under ideal conditions. The number of offspring a species may produce under ideal conditions. It's their potential, their reproductive potential, really. So when we think about this, different species, different types of organisms have different ways that they reproduce. And we know that in terms of kind of what the goals of their reproductive process are. So when we think about the two reproductive strategies, generally speaking, that species have, like I said, we categorize them into two different ways, or two different strategies. The organisms that we label as K strategists and the organisms that we label as R strategists. Okay, I'll put them back both up there. K strategists are organisms like we are, organisms like a lot of our larger mammals are, elephants, okay, etc., where they have very low reproductive rates. Okay, we don't generally have hundreds of offspring. Okay, we can't do that. We could have 20 offspring, but that is very rare. Okay, generally speaking, our K strategists have low reproductive rates. We don't produce a lot of offspring quickly by any means. And we, again, produce low numbers of offspring. We have a lot of investment in our offspring. So we don't just, have offspring and we leave them on their own. Okay, we care for them, we protect our offspring, we teach them how to do things. Okay, we have really long gestation time, so we have 9 to 10 month pregnancies. So do elephants have longer times, and all of our mammals, they carry their babies for an extended period of time. So low reproductive rates, we care and protect our offspring. We have long gestation times. This is a strategy that many species, populations of species have, and it's a good one. Okay, so we invest a lot in our offspring. We make sure that they can hopefully will reach reproductive age. They will reproduce our species, so it will persist on Earth, and that's a good way to do it. Okay, to protect our offspring, to make sure they get to that point. Okay, and we invest a lot in it. And the idea is that our offspring will make it to reproductive age, they will hopefully reproduce successfully, and our species will persist. Okay, our strategists have a very different strategy or approach. Okay, they produce massive numbers of offspring. There is very little investment in the offspring, and they have very high reproductive rates. They have short gestation. Okay, just the opposite of what we call a K strategist. So the R strategist, things like, organisms like insects, very quickly, okay, can reproduce themselves. If you've been in your bio class and you've done genetic studies, we often use fruit flies because we can study them from generation to generation in, a short amount of time, in week after week, instead of many, many years.
All right, we can look at generation to generation in a short amount of time because they are our strategists. They reproduce very rapidly, and so therefore they're easy for us to study. Okay, so you might say this seems kind of like it is a very different strategy. The R strategists, the way that they work is that they figure, well, if I produce, okay, inherently, that we produce a lot of offspring, chances are some of them are going to make it. Okay, I'm going to lay some eggs. Hopefully they'll get fertilized. They'll make offspring. And they'll be, even if I lay thousands of eggs, hey, well, if we get 100 out of it, great. Okay, with fish. Okay, thousands of eggs, expecting them to get fertilized. They get fertilized and they make fish babies. Great. Okay, now, well, I'm going to leave them unattended, so it's possible that they'll all get eaten. But if I do so many, chances are I can go off and do something else, and some of them will get fertilized, and some of them won't get eaten, and some of them will survive, and so we'll be able to reproduce our species. So again, generally speaking, we can categorize most species into one of these two categories, either the K strategist or the R strategist. And there's pros and cons of both, but they're both good strategies. They're just very, very different. All right, going back to what we talked about in our last lecture, the limiting factors and the carrying capacity, again, they're related. How, the biotic potential of an organism, or of a population, I should say, is going to have limiting factors, all right? If, for example, a species, an aquatic species, the oxygen of the water declines and puts stress on that species, oftentimes a species will slow down their reproduction. All right, when we think about, what's more important, eating and living or reproducing, often we'll put ourselves first. We'll say, well, I can't reproduce if I don't eat. So I have to spend energy to eat, and I have to spend energy to survive. What's the point in reproducing if I can't even get to that point? First, survival is most important, and then survival of the species often comes secondary. So limiting factors, when we talk about environmental impacts, is a big deal. All right, when we stress out species, often what they do is they don't reproduce. Think about when we put our pandas into captivity. We get all excited when they actually reproduce. When we have the tigers or at the zoo and they reproduce, we get really excited because it's it's a very different environment for them. And maybe they don't have the space they typically have. Their normal existence is altered, and that can change. Maybe their diets change, something's different, and oftentimes they won't reproduce like they would in the wild. So limiting factors are a big deal when we talk about species survival, because oftentimes reproductive is the first thing to be cut off. I've got to grow, I've got to protect myself, I've got to eat, I've got to, survive, and that's number one. And when their bodies have to make choices, often reproductive is the thing that doesn't happen. Reproduction doesn't happen, and that is critical for species survival. So the last thing there I alluded to when we talked about the S curve, or the logistic growth curve, and you saw that K on there, and you see it in K strategist. That K stands for the carrying capacity. And let's get a definition for that. We define carrying capacity as the maximum population that a habitat will support without degrading the habitat over the long term. The maximum population that a habitat will support without degrading the habitat over the long term. So when we look at that logistic curve, we see a leveling out of the population around that carrying capacity. So basically, the environment determines what organisms can live there and how many of them can be there. It's going to supply the food, the space, the water, all of those things. And there's going to be some kind of factor that's going to cause that species to not be able to grow a lot larger, or that population not to grow a lot larger.
Okay, all these plant species have all the light they need and all the water they need, but they might be missing an essential element. Without that, some plant is going to be limited. Okay, not everybody's going to have access to it, and that's going to keep the population numbers under check. Okay, and that's important for any population. Okay, we don't typically see this exponential growth like a J curve. Okay, certain species do that, but we're not typically going to see a K strategist species just exponentially grow like that. Okay, not naturally. Okay, they're not going to do that. They're going to hover around some kind of carrying capacity that the environment's going to say, that's it. As we see exponential growth curves, those J curves, yeah, they're, again, I said it's not going to keep growing and growing and growing. Typically, there's going to be something that's going to limit how big that population can get. And bam, it's going to be knocked back down. So, our insect example was that they'll grow, like mosquitoes will come out in the spring, they'll thrive in the summer, and then all of a sudden we'll have a cold snap and they'll die, because that is, temperature is going to become a limiting factor for them. They can't do what they need to do, they can't survive, they can't reproduce, they can't increase their numbers, etc. Okay, so carrying capacity is a big deal, and it's going to be important when we certainly talk about human population in our next topic. Okay, our next slide is about talking about our endangered species and species that are, like I said, threatened or endangered. There's something we call the critical number for a population, and that's the minimum number, the minimum population number needed for a species to survive. That's the critical number, that minimum number, a population number needed for a species to survive. And that number depends on the species that we're talking about, or the population we're talking about. And when we think about sexually reproducing organisms like humans or tigers, for example, that number isn't just two, a male and a female. Okay, keep in mind that we need a big gene pool to keep a healthy population. So that doesn't really work. We can't just have one male and one female repopulate because the gene pool is too small. And when we have that inbreeding, it often causes genetic abnormalities or defects in the population that persist and can be just as damaging to a population. So critical number, again, is going to be more than two, certainly for sexually reproducing populations, but again, it's got to be much higher than that to have a successful species population. Okay, so very important. So we basically base our threatened and endangered species off that critical number. We say a species is threatened when the species population is decreasing rapidly. So all of a sudden we'll be doing organism counts or population counts, and we'll see that just the species is being decimated. What is going on? The population is decreasing rapidly. That species will go on what we call the threatened list, and we'll start looking at, what's going on, what is causing the species decline. Okay, as that population starts to approach what we call the critical number, that minimum number needed for a species to survive, we put it on the endangered list. So as that population is approaching the critical number, it gets put on the endangered list, because we know if the population falls below the critical number, it might not be able to rebound. So we call it an endangered, and it receives additional protections from us. Okay, so if it exists in a place where we're deforesting, we try to preserve land for it to live. We, just set aside space so they can reproduce. We bring them into captivity. We try to reproduce them there, and we release them. So there's a lot of things that we do, but endangered species receive additional protections, and that's really a big deal. You can click on what this is. It's called the Red List, and it takes you to the website that really goes through tons and tons of endangered and threatened critical species on the planet. And again, some of them are the big ones that we're more familiar with, and then some of them are certainly things that we've never heard of. But again, have been deemed important in their food webs, in their ecosystems, so may or may not receive some additional protection. So you can check that out if you'd like to.